You feel overwhelmed by daily pressures that seem to multiply endlessly, leaving you reactive instead of responsive to every crisis. The stress follows you home, disrupts your sleep, and slowly erodes the calm, confident person you once were. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who maintained unshakable inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history during plagues, wars, and constant political turmoil. Through my daily practice of Stoic principles, I discovered how to build a fortress of calm that no external pressure could penetrate. What I learned about inner mastery will transform how you respond to stress and setbacks, giving you the mental resilience that turns pressure into power. The same philosophy that sustained me through governing millions of lives can sustain you through any modern challenge. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner strength has spread. I never wanted to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his heir, I felt the weight of an empire settle on my shoulders like a lead cloak. I was a philosopher, drawn to contemplation and the pursuit of wisdom, not the brutal realities of governing millions of souls across the known world. The golden medallion I wear bears the inscription, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." But there were days when I doubted even that fundamental truth. The imperial correspondence scroll that arrived each morning brought news that would test any man's resolve. Plague ravaging the eastern provinces, barbarian tribes pressing against our borders, senators plotting in the shadows, and always, the crushing responsibility of decisions that would determine whether thousands lived or died. I remember the morning when a dispatch arrived from Marcus Claudius Fronto, governor of Syria. The Antonine plague had reached Damascus, and he begged for guidance. Should they quarantine the city and risk economic collapse, or allow trade to continue and watch the disease spread? As I held that scroll in my trembling hands, I felt the weight of every life hanging in the balance. Whatever I decided, people would suffer. Whatever choice I made, families would be destroyed. The sleepless nights became routine. I would pace the marble floors of my private chambers, tormented by the impossibility of my position. How could one man bear the responsibility for an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia? How could I make decisions about wars I would never fight, about people I would never meet, about consequences that would ripple through generations? My wife Faustina would find me in my study, hunched over reports by lamplight, my shoulders rigid with tension. "You cannot save everyone, Marcus," she would whisper, but her words felt like hollow comfort against the magnitude of my burden. I was expected to be divine, infallible, a living God who never doubted or faltered. Yet inside, I was drowning in the chaos of human suffering and political complexity. The breaking point came during a particularly dark period, when Germanic tribes had breached our northern borders, while plague continued its merciless march through our cities. Standing in the Senate, listening to heated debates about military strategy while knowing that delay meant more death, I felt something crack inside my chest. The external pressures had nearly shattered my spirit entirely. That night, alone in my chambers, with reports of mounting casualties scattered across my desk, I realized that no amount of political maneuvering or military might could control the chaos swirling around me. The empire would face crises, whether I worried myself to death or not. Barbarians would attack regardless of my anxiety. Plague would spread regardless of my sleepless nights. The only thing within my power was how I chose to respond to these unchangeable realities. It was in that moment of complete helplessness that I understood the profound truth my Stoic teachers had tried to impart. External circumstances are not the enemy. My reaction to them was, my introduction to Stoic philosophy came through Junius Rusticus, my most influential teacher, who carried with him a leather pouch filled with smooth river stones that would forever change my understanding of life. These teaching stones, worn smooth by countless years of flowing water, became the physical representation of the most profound lesson I would ever learn. I was 17 when Rusticus first placed 2 stones in my palm during one of our walks through the imperial gardens. One stone was rough and jagged, recently broken from a larger rock. The other was perfectly smooth, polished by decades of river current. "Which stone had the easier journey?" he asked, his weathered face serious in the afternoon light. I examined both stones carefully, assuming this was some test of observation. "The smooth one," I replied confidently. "It was gently shaped by water over time, while the rough one was violently torn from its source." Rusticus smiled and shook his head. "The rough stone complains about every force that touches it. It resists the water, fights the current, and remains unchanged by its struggles. The smooth stone learned to flow with the river's power, allowing each current to shape it into something more beautiful. Which stone do you wish to be, Marcus?" That simple demonstration shattered my understanding of strength and resistance. I had spent my youth believing that power meant controlling outcomes, that wisdom meant having all the answers, that leadership required dominating circumstances. The stones taught me that true strength comes from adaptability, not rigidity. Rusticus introduced me to the writings of Epictetus, the former slave whose chains had been broken by philosophy rather than politics. When I first read Epictetus's fundamental teaching, that we suffer not from events themselves but from our judgments about events, I felt something shift in my chest, like a locked door suddenly swinging open. I began to understand that every morning I woke up and made a choice. I could approach the day like the rough stone, fighting against every unwelcome development, or I could flow like the smooth stone, adapting and growing stronger through each challenge. The choice was always mine, regardless of what external forces pressed against me. My teacher also shared stories of Cato the Younger, who maintained his principles even when facing political defeat and personal loss. Cato understood, Rusticus explained, that our character is the only possession that can never be taken from us. Armies can conquer territories, but they cannot conquer a disciplined mind. The more I studied these teachings, the more I realized that philosophy wasn't merely an academic pursuit. It was a practical toolkit for navigating the inevitable suffering of human existence. Every principle, every exercise, every meditation was designed to build inner resilience that could withstand any external storm. I started practicing daily reflection, examining my thoughts and reactions with the same scrutiny I applied to military strategy. I learned to distinguish between what was up to me, my choices, my character, my responses, and what was not up to me, other people's actions, natural disasters, the ultimate outcomes of my efforts. This distinction became my anchor. When senators criticized my policies, I reminded myself that their opinions were not up to me, but my response was. When plague spread despite our best efforts, I accepted that the disease was not up to me, but my leadership during crisis was. When barbarians threatened our borders, I understood that their aggression was not up to me, but my courage in facing them was. Philosophy transformed from intellectual exercise into spiritual practice. Each stone in Rusticus's pouch represented a different Stoic principle, and he would have me hold them during meditation, feeling their weight and texture while contemplating their lessons. The stones became my companions, tangible reminders that wisdom must be felt in the body, not just understood by the mind. By the time I ascended to the throne, these teachings had become the foundation of my inner life, preparing me for the trials that no political education could have anticipated. In my private chambers, I keep a polished bronze mirror that serves a purpose far beyond reflecting my physical appearance. This perspective mirror reminds me daily that how we see events determines their power over us more than the events themselves. Learning to discipline my perception became the most transformative skill of my reign. I learned this lesson most powerfully during the Germanic Wars, when our forces faced what appeared to be an impossible situation. The Marcomanni and Quadi tribes had united against us, outnumbering our legions 3-1. My generals came to me with reports painted in the darkest terms. Caesar, we face annihilation. The enemy is too strong, too numerous. We should retreat and regroup. Standing in my command tent, studying the tactical maps by flickering lamplight, I felt the familiar weight of despair settling over the situation. But then I remembered the discipline of perception that Epictetus had taught me. I asked myself, what else could this situation be beyond the story of inevitable defeat my mind is telling me? I looked again at the same maps, the same troop numbers, the same terrain. But this time, I chose to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. Yes, we were outnumbered, but that meant the enemy was overconfident. Yes, they had united multiple tribes, but such alliances are inherently unstable. Yes, we faced difficult terrain, but we knew it better than they did. The same facts remained unchanged, but by shifting my perception, I transformed our impossible situation into a challenging opportunity. We used the enemy's numbers against them, drawing them into narrow passes where their superior force became a liability. We exploited the natural tensions between their allied tribes. We turned their overconfidence into recklessness. The victory that followed wasn't due to changed circumstances. It came from changed perception. The battlefield remained the same, but I had learned to see it through different eyes. This discipline of perception extends far beyond military strategy. When senators opposed my policies, I could perceive their resistance as either personal attacks on my authority or valuable feedback that might improve my decisions. When citizens complained about new taxes, I could see either ungrateful subjects or people struggling with legitimate hardships. The choice of perception was always mine. I developed a daily practice of examining my initial reactions to events and asking, what else could this mean? How might this serve a good purpose? What opportunity might be hidden within this apparent setback? This wasn't mere optimism. It was rigorous intellectual honesty about the multiple ways any situation could be interpreted. During the Antonine Plague, when death stalked our cities and people looked to me for answers I didn't have, I faced the choice between seeing myself as a helpless ruler watching his empire crumble, or as a leader being forged in the fire of ultimate challenge. I chose to perceive the plague as a test of our collective character, an opportunity to demonstrate Roman virtues of courage, solidarity, and rational response to crisis. The disease remained equally deadly regardless of my perception, but my response became more effective because I approached it as a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be endured. We organized relief efforts, established medical protocols, and maintained civil order because I had disciplined myself to see possibilities rather than just problems. I learned to distinguish between the raw facts of any situation and the story my mind told about those facts. A senator's criticism was just words spoken in a particular tone. The meaning I assigned to those words determined whether they became weapons against my peace of mind or tools for improvement. The perspective mirror reflects this truth back. To me, each morning, the same face can appear confident or worried, strong or weak, depending on the light and angle from which I view it. Events in our lives work the same way. A setback can be seen as evidence of our inadequacy or as information about what needs adjustment. A conflict can be perceived as personal attack or as an opportunity to practice patience and understanding. This discipline requires constant vigilance because our minds naturally gravitate toward dramatic interpretations. We prefer stories of complete triumph or total disaster over the more accurate narrative of ordinary people navigating ordinary challenges with varying degrees of skill and wisdom. When you learn to discipline your perception, you discover that most of what troubles you exists not in the world but in your interpretation of the world. This realization is not meant to dismiss real suffering or genuine problems, but to ensure that you respond to what is actually happening rather than to the fearful stories your mind creates about what might happen. In my study, I keep architectural plans for a fortress that was never built, not because it was impossible to construct, but because it was never meant to exist in the physical world. These blueprints map the inner citadel, the unconquerable sanctuary within the human soul that no external force can breach, no matter how powerful or persistent. I first understood the need for this inner fortress during a particularly brutal winter campaign against the Germanic tribes. We were encamped along the frozen Danube, and I had contracted a fever that left me weak and disoriented. For 3 days I lay in my tent while barbarian war cries echoed across the ice, and my own generals whispered doubts about my leadership. In my delirium I experienced a profound vision. I saw myself as a city under siege, with enemy forces, doubt, fear, anger, desperation, surrounding my walls and seeking every possible point of entry. But deep within this besieged city stood an inner keep, a final stronghold that remained untouched by the chaos raging outside its walls. When the fever broke, I realized that this vision had shown me the most important truth of human existence. We all have within us an inviolable core that remains free regardless of external circumstances. This inner citadel houses our ability to choose our responses, maintain our principles, and preserve our dignity, even when everything else is stripped away. I began each day by retreating to this inner sanctuary through morning meditation. Before facing the endless demands of empire, I would spend an hour in contemplation, strengthening the walls of my inner citadel and preparing for whatever siege the day might bring. This wasn't escapism, it was the most practical preparation possible. For effective leadership, the morning practice became sacred ritual. I would sit facing east, watching the sun rise over Rome, and methodically examine the fortress of my soul. Were there weak points where negative emotions might breach my defenses? Had I allowed criticism or praise to create cracks in my foundation? Was my commitment to virtue still the unshakable bedrock upon which everything else was built? During these quiet hours, I learned to distinguish between my external roles, emperor, general, judge, and my essential self. The roles could be challenged, criticized, even stripped away, but the inner citadel remained constant. It was here that I stored my deepest convictions, my commitment to justice, my love for humanity, and my determination to act according to principle rather than convenience. The blueprints I keep show this fortress in precise detail. The outer walls represent disciplined thinking, the ability to examine thoughts before accepting them as truth. The inner courtyard houses rational judgment, where decisions are made based on wisdom rather than emotion. The central keep contains the governing faculty, the consciousness that observes and chooses how to respond to every situation. I learned to provision this inner fortress like any military commander would prepare for siege. I stocked it with philosophical principles that could sustain me during the longest conflicts. I established supply lines through daily reading and reflection that would keep me connected to wisdom, even when isolated by crisis. I trained the garrison, my habits, and automaticum, responses to defend the citadel without conscious effort. Evening reflection became the companion practice to morning meditation. Each night I would inspect my inner fortress like a commanding officer reviewing his defenses. Where had I allowed external pressures to penetrate my peace? When had I responded from wounded ego rather than principled choice? What repairs needed to be made before tomorrow's inevitable challenges? The most crucial element of the inner citadel is its independence from external validation. When senators praised my policies, I felt grateful but not elevated. Praise could not add to the strength of my inner walls. When critics attacked my decisions, I felt challenged but not diminished. Criticism could not breach my fundamental worth. The fortress stood on foundations deeper than public opinion. I discovered that this inner sanctuary becomes stronger through use, not weaker. Each time I retreated to the citadel during crisis, each time I chose principle over convenience, each time I maintained dignity under pressure, the walls grew higher and the foundation more solid. Adversity became my architect, designing ever stronger defenses. The inner citadel is not a place of isolation, but of connection. Connection to your deepest values, your highest aspirations, your commitment to growth and service. From this secure base, you can engage fully with the world without being consumed by its chaos. You can love without being destroyed by loss, lead without being corrupted by power, and serve without being diminished by ingratitude. This fortress exists within you right now, whether you have acknowledged it or not. Every moment of ethical choice strengthens its walls. Every decision to respond rather than react adds to its defenses. Every commitment to growth rather than comfort expands its territory. The blueprints are written in your conscience. The construction materials are found in your daily choices. On my desk sits a golden compass, unlike any used for navigation. Instead of pointing north, its 4 arms point to wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, the cardinal virtues that became my true north through every storm of leadership. This compass taught me the most liberating truth I ever discovered. Virtue is the only good that can never be taken from you. I learned this lesson through devastating loss. When my young son Varus died of plague, I thought my world had ended. The boy had been my pride, my hope for the future, the living symbol of my dynasty's continuation. As I held his small, still form, I felt as though everything good in my life had been stripped away in a single moment of cruel fate. For days, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on imperial duties. The palace felt like a tomb, and I wandered its corridors like a ghost, haunting my own life. Officials waited nervously for decisions that I seemed incapable of making. The empire continued to need leadership, while its emperor drowned in grief. It was then that I turned to my compass, not for geographical direction, but for spiritual orientation. As I held the golden instrument in my trembling hands, I forced myself to examine what had actually been lost and what remained untouched by death. Varus was gone, his laughter, his curiosity, his innocent questions about the world. The external good of his presence had been taken from me, and no amount of imperial power could restore it. But as I contemplated each point of my compass, I realized that nothing truly essential had been destroyed. My wisdom, the lessons learned through study and experience, remained intact. Death could not erase what I had discovered about life's meaning and purpose. My commitment to justice continued undiminished. If anything, the pain of loss made me more sensitive to others' suffering. My courage, tested by this ultimate trial, proved stronger than I had imagined. My temperance, the discipline to face reality without being destroyed by it, had been forged stronger in grief's fire. The compass revealed that I had been confusing what was truly mine with what had merely been on loan. My son's life, precious as it was, had never belonged to me. His time with us was a gift, not a possession, but my response to his death, whether I chose wisdom or bitterness, justice or selfishness, courage or despair, that was entirely mine to determine. This realization transformed my understanding of security and success. I had been building my happiness on foundations of sand, external things that could be swept away by fortune's changing tides. Health, wealth, popular approval, even the lives of those I loved most. All of these were subject to forces beyond my control. But virtue required no such external support. I could practice wisdom in poverty as easily as in wealth. Justice remained accessible to me, whether I ruled an empire or lived in exile. Courage could be demonstrated in failure as readily as in victory. Temperance was needed more during abundance than scarcity. During the plague years that followed, I watched this truth play out on a massive scale. Citizens who had built their happiness on external goods, property, social status, physical beauty, crumbled when disease stripped these away. But those who had cultivated character, who had built their lives around service and principle, maintained their dignity and purpose even as everything else fell apart. I began to see virtue not as a burden or restriction, but as the ultimate freedom. When your sense of worth depends on external validation, you become a slave to others' opinions. When your happiness requires specific circumstances, you live in constant anxiety about losing them. When your identity is tied to possessions or positions, you spend your energy defending rather than growing. But when you anchor your life in virtue, you become truly independent. Critics cannot diminish your worth because it doesn't depend on their approval. Setbacks cannot destroy your happiness because it springs from character, not circumstances. Loss can't devastate you because your most precious possessions, your integrity, your compassion, your wisdom, travel with you wherever you go. The compass became my daily reminder to ask the essential question: am I choosing virtue in this moment? When facing difficult decisions, I would touch each of its 4 points and consider how wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance would guide my response. The external pressures remained the same, but my internal orientation never wavered. This is not philosophical abstraction, but practical survival strategy. In a world where everything external is uncertain, virtue provides the only reliable foundation for a meaningful life. It's the one investment that always pays dividends, the one possession that appreciates with age, the one inheritance you can guarantee to leave behind. Your character is being built right now, in this moment, through the choices you make when no one is watching, and the principles you maintain when maintaining them costs you something. This is the only work that truly matters, the only wealth that never depreciates, the only success that cannot be taken away. In my private study, I keep a parchment scroll that most would find morbid, a detailed list of everything I hold dear, written in my own hand for the purpose of imagining its loss. This loss meditation scroll contains the names of my loved ones, descriptions of my health and faculties, accounts of my positions and possessions, all catalogued not to boast of my good fortune, but to prepare for its inevitable change. Each evening, I would unroll this scroll and practice what my Stoic teachers called negative visualization, deliberately imagining the loss of what I treasured most. This wasn't pessimism or morbid dwelling, but the most practical form of mental training I ever discovered. By rehearsing loss in my mind, I built resilience for when loss inevitably arrived in reality. I remember the first time Rusticus introduced me to this practice. We were walking through the imperial gardens on a perfect spring morning, surrounded by blooming roses and singing birds. "Imagine," he said quietly, "that tomorrow all of this beauty will be gone. The roses will wither, the birds will fall silent, the gardens will turn to dust. How does this change your experience of this moment?" My initial reaction was resistance. Why poison a beautiful experience with thoughts of its ending? But as I forced myself to truly contemplate the temporary nature of what I was enjoying, something unexpected happened. The roses seemed more vivid, their fragrance more precious. The bird songs became sweeter, because I heard them with the awareness that such songs don't last forever. That evening, I began my formal practice of negative visualization. I would spend 10 minutes imagining the loss of my health, my position, my loved ones, my life itself, not in a spirit of fatalism or despair, but as mental preparation for the universal human experience of impermanence. When I imagined losing my sight, I found myself paying deeper attention to visual beauty during the day. When I contemplated the death of friends, I became more present and affectionate in their company. When I visualized the collapse of the empire, I felt more motivated to govern wisely while I had the opportunity. The practice taught me the difference between attachment and appreciation. Attachment means believing that your happiness depends on keeping specific things forever. Appreciation means recognizing the gift of experiencing them temporarily. Attachment creates anxiety about loss. Appreciation creates gratitude for presence. During the Germanic campaigns, I would lie in my tent at night practicing negative visualization about the next day's battle. I would imagine defeat, capture, or death, not to demoralize myself, but to ensure that if such outcomes occurred, they wouldn't find me psychologically unprepared. This mental rehearsal allowed me to face genuine danger with equanimity, because I had already faced it in my imagination. The most powerful application came when I practiced visualizing the loss of my imperial power. Each night, I would imagine waking up as an ordinary citizen, stripped of wealth and authority. I would picture myself in exile, dependent on others' charity, forgotten by history. Rather than filling me with dread, these exercises filled me with appreciation for my current opportunities to serve, and with determination to use my position virtuously while I possessed it. I discovered that anticipating loss paradoxically reduced its power to harm me. When you've already grieved something in your mind, its actual loss feels less like devastation and more like the completion of a process you've already begun. You respond with sadness, but not surprise, grief, but not shock. The scroll also served as a gratitude generator. After imagining the loss of my wife's companionship, her actual presence at dinner felt like an unexpected gift. After visualizing blindness, the simple act of reading became a marvel. After contemplating exile, even the burdens of imperial responsibility seemed like privileges worth cherishing. I learned to apply this practice to smaller daily annoyances as well. When a senator criticized my policies, I had already imagined far worse criticism. When illness confined me to bed, I had already rehearsed far greater physical limitations. When plans went awry, I had already considered much more severe disruptions. Negative visualization also revealed the arbitrary nature of my attachments. Why should I be devastated by losing wealth, but not by losing poverty? Why should the death of one person destroy me while the death of thousands moves me less? The practice helped me examine which of my attachments served virtue and which merely served ego. The most profound insight came from visualizing my own death, not in a morbid fixation, but as honest acknowledgement of mortality's certainty. When I truly accepted that my time was limited, every day became more precious. Every opportunity to act with virtue became urgent. Every moment of beauty or connection became a gift rather than an entitlement. This practice doesn't make you indifferent to loss. It makes you resilient through loss. The goal isn't to stop caring about what matters to you, but to hold what matters lightly enough that when it inevitably changes or ends, you can let go with grace, rather than being destroyed by resistance. I carry with me always a simple stone, half black and half white, that represents the most fundamental division in human experience, the clear separation between what is up to us and what is not. This dichotomy stone became my anchor during the darkest period of my reign, when the Antonine Plague swept through our empire like an invisible army that no military strategy could defeat. The plague arrived in Rome during the winter of my 7th year as emperor, carried by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Within weeks, it had spread through every district of the city, then along every trade route of the empire. Citizens fled their homes, businesses shuttered, and even the Senate struggled to maintain quorum as death stalked rich and poor alike. I remember standing in the imperial palace courtyard, watching smoke rise from countless funeral pyres across the city, feeling utterly powerless despite commanding the greatest military force in the world. My advisors came to me with increasingly desperate proposals: close all borders, quarantine entire provinces, execute suspected carriers, pray to different gods, try exotic remedies from distant lands. Every fiber of my being wanted to control this catastrophe, to issue commands that would halt the disease's advance. I was accustomed to solving problems through decisive action, but here was a challenge that mocked human authority. the plague would spread or recede according to its own nature, regardless of imperial decrees. That night, alone in my study with reports of mounting casualties covering my desk, I held the dichotomy stone in my palm and forced myself to perform the most difficult exercise of my life. I would sort every aspect of the plague crisis into two categories: what was up to me and what was not. The disease itself, not up to me. How quickly it spread, not up to me. Who lived and who died, not up to me. The panic in the streets, not up to me. The economic disruption, not up to me. The political implications of appearing powerless, not up to me. But then I turned to the other side of the stone. My response to the crisis, up to me. The quality of leadership I provided during chaos, up to me. How I allocated imperial resources, up to me. The example I set for citizens facing terror, up to me. My commitment to justice even during emergency, up to me. The courage I displayed in the face of my own mortality, up to me. This exercise was agonizing because it required abandoning the illusion of control that makes leadership bearable. I had to accept that I could not save everyone, could not stop the plague, could not prevent the empire from suffering. But in releasing that impossible responsibility, I discovered the power that actually belonged to me. I stopped wasting energy on elaborate plans to control the uncontrollable and focused entirely on exercising my actual authority. I organized relief efforts for plague victims, not because I could guarantee their success, but because organizing relief was within my power. I maintained civil order, not because I could prevent all panic, but because steady leadership was my responsibility. I continued to hold court and make decisions, not because I could eliminate uncertainty, but because functioning governance was what I could provide. The most liberating moment came when I realized that accepting what I couldn't control actually increased my effectiveness in areas where I did have influence. When I stopped exhausting myself trying to halt the plague's spread, I had more energy for ensuring that food reached quarantined areas. When I accepted that some citizens would panic regardless of my words, I could focus on speaking truthfully to those who would listen. I began each morning by examining my plans through the lens of the dichotomy stone. Which of my concerns belonged to the up to me category and which belonged to not up to me? I would systematically release anxiety about everything in the second category and channel all my energy toward the first. This practice revealed how much mental energy I had been wasting on things beyond my influence. I worried about what historians would write about my reign, not up to me. I fretted about whether citizens appreciated my efforts, not up to me. I lost sleep over whether other nations would respect our weakened state, not up to me, but I could. Control how thoroughly I prepared for decisions, up to me. I could determine how honestly I communicated with citizens, up to me. I could choose how courageously I faced each day's challenges, up to me. The dichotomy stone taught me that resistance to uncontrollable events doesn't change the events, but destroys our peace and effectiveness. When I accepted that plague would run its course regardless of my emotional state, I could respond with rational care instead of desperate flailing. I learned to recognize the signs of wasted energy, frustration with other people's choices, anxiety about outcomes beyond my influence, anger at circumstances that couldn't be changed. Each time I felt these emotions, I would touch the stone and ask, is this up to me or not up to me? If not up to me, I would consciously release it and redirect my attention to what I could actually influence. The practice doesn't eliminate caring about outcomes. It eliminates the suffering that comes from believing you can control outcomes through worry and resistance. You still work diligently toward good results, but you hold those results lightly, knowing that your job is to plant seeds, not to control the weather that determines their growth. By the time the plague finally receded 3 years later, I had been transformed by this practice of radical acceptance. I emerged not as a leader who had controlled an uncontrollable crisis, but as a person who had learned to find peace within chaos and effectiveness within limitation. On my writing desk lies a broken chain, each link forged from precious metal that once bound me more securely than any physical restraint. This desire chain represents the invisible shackles I wore for years, the tyranny of wanting what I could not have, the prison of unfulfilled longings that made me a slave within my own palace. The chain was forged in my youth when I believed that happiness meant acquiring everything I desired and avoiding everything I feared. Each link represented a different craving, the need for universal approval, the hunger for absolute certainty, the demand that life conform to my expectations, the requirement that others behave according to my wishes. I remember the moment I understood how completely these desires controlled me. It was during a Senate session where Marcus Cato had publicly opposed one of my proposed laws. As I sat on the imperial throne, listening to his eloquent criticism, I felt rage building in my chest like molten metal. How dare this senator question my judgment? How could he fail to see the wisdom of my proposal? Why wouldn't he simply agree and make my life easier? That night I couldn't sleep. I paced my chambers, rehearsing arguments I would make against Cato, planning ways to undermine his influence, imagining scenarios where he would apologize and admit his error. Hours passed in this mental torture, and I realized with horror that a single senator's disagreement had completely hijacked my peace of mind. I was the most powerful man in the world, yet I had given a critic complete control over my emotional state. My happiness had become dependent on his approval, something entirely outside my authority. I had made myself a prisoner of his opinions. The next morning, I began examining all my desires with the same ruthless honesty. I discovered that most of my daily frustrations came from wanting people to be different than they were. I wanted senators to be wiser, citizens to be more grateful, enemies to be less persistent, allies to be more loyal. I wanted the weather to cooperate with my plans, the plague to respect imperial authority, time to move slower during moments of joy, and faster during periods of suffering. Each of these desires was a link in the chain that bound me to misery. The more I demanded that reality conform to my preferences, the more reality disappointed me. The harder I grasped for control over uncontrollable things, the more powerless I felt. I learned from my Stoic teachers that desire itself wasn't the problem. The problem was desiring things that weren't up to me. Wanting other people to change, wanting circumstances to be different, wanting the past to have unfolded differently, wanting certainty about the future. These desires guaranteed suffering because they focused on things beyond my control. The liberation came when I learned to redirect my desires toward things that were actually within my power. Instead of wanting Cato to agree with me, I could desire to respond to his criticism with dignity. Instead of wanting enemies to stop threatening our borders, I could desire to defend them courageously. Instead of wanting the plague to end immediately, I could desire to lead with wisdom during crisis. This wasn't suppressing desire, but disciplining it, training my longing to focus on achievable targets. I began wanting things that were actually possible, to grow in wisdom through today's challenges, to act with justice in this moment's decision, to respond with courage to whatever arose, to practice temperance in all my choices. The transformation was immediate and profound. When I desired only what was up to me, I achieved my desires regularly. When senators disagreed with me, I got exactly what I wanted, an opportunity to practice patience. When crises arose, I received precisely what I hoped for, a chance to demonstrate leadership. When critics attacked my policies, I obtained my heart's desire, a test of my commitment to principle over popularity. I learned to catch myself in moments of undisciplined desire. When I felt frustrated with someone's behavior, I would ask, am I wanting this person to be different, or am I wanting myself to respond well to who they are? When I felt anxious about outcomes, I would inquire, am I desiring to control results, or am I desiring to give my best effort regardless of results? The broken chain reminds me daily that freedom comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you can actually achieve. When your desires align with your actual power, you live in a state of constant fulfillment. When your longings focus on things beyond your control, you live in perpetual disappointment. I discovered that most advertising, most social pressure, most cultural messaging is designed to forge new links in the desire chain, to make you want things that will keep you dissatisfied and striving. The discipline of desire means regularly examining what you're being encouraged to want and asking whether those desires serve your freedom or your bondage. The ultimate irony is that when you stop desperately wanting things beyond your control, you often influence them more effectively. When I stopped demanding that senators agree with me and focused instead on presenting my ideas clearly and listening respectfully to opposition, more senators began supporting my proposals. When I stopped requiring that citizens appreciate my efforts and concentrated on serving them, regardless of their gratitude, public approval actually increased. This is the paradox of the discipline of desire. When you want less, you often get more. When you need less from others, they often give more freely. When you demand less from circumstances, they often cooperate more readily. The broken chain represents not the death of desire, but its transformation from master to servant. In my private study stands a peculiar stone sculpture, rough and jagged when I first acquired it, now polished smooth through years of handling. This impediment stone teaches the most counterintuitive lesson of my philosophical education. The obstacle is the way forward, and resistance creates the very strength needed to overcome future challenges. I discovered this truth during the most devastating military defeat of my reign. The Marcomanni had broken through our northern defenses using tactics we hadn't anticipated, routing 2 of our finest legions and capturing strategic positions that had protected Rome for generations. As reports of the disaster reached my command tent, I felt the familiar weight of catastrophic failure settling over everything I had worked to build. My initial reaction was exactly what you might expect: rage at the tactical failures, despair over the lost soldiers, fear about the empire's vulnerability, shame at my inadequacy as a military leader. I spent 3 sleepless nights replaying every decision that had led to this disaster, torturing myself with alternative strategies that might have prevented such losses. But on the 4th morning, as I held the rough impediment stone in my palm, something shifted in my understanding. I began to ask different questions. What if this defeat was exactly what we needed to learn? What if our previous successes had made us overconfident and predictable? What if this obstacle was actually the path to becoming a stronger, more adaptable force? I examined the stone's rough surface, feeling each sharp edge and jagged corner. Then I noticed something remarkable. The areas that had been worn smooth by handling were the very places where friction had been greatest. The stone became beautiful, not despite the pressure applied to it, but because of that pressure. The military analogy became clear. Our defeated legions hadn't been destroyed, they had been educated. The soldiers who survived this defeat would never again underestimate barbarian tactical innovation. The commanders who witnessed this failure would develop new strategies that accounted for previously unconsidered variables. The empire itself would emerge stronger because it had been forced to adapt. I called my remaining generals together and reframed our entire approach to the crisis. Instead of treating the defeat as evidence of our weakness, we would treat it as intelligence about our enemy's capabilities. Instead of mourning what we had lost, we would focus on what we had learned. Instead of fearing future battles, we would use this obstacle as training for greater victories. We spent weeks analyzing every aspect of our defeat, extracting lessons that would have been impossible to learn through victory. We discovered flaws in our communication systems that might never have been revealed during successful campaigns. We identified weaknesses in our tactical doctrine that had been masked by fighting less innovative enemies. We recognized leadership, gaps that success had allowed us to ignore. Most importantly, we developed new battle strategies specifically designed to turn our previous vulnerability into strength. The very tactics that had defeated us became the foundation for our next campaign's success. We taught our troops to expect the unexpected, to adapt rapidly to changing conditions, to find opportunity within apparent disaster. When we finally engaged the Marcomanni again, 6 months later, we fought with a flexibility and resilience that surprised even our enemies. The obstacle that had nearly broken us had instead forged us into a more formidable force. We won not by avoiding difficulty, but by allowing difficulty to improve us. This principle extends far beyond military strategy into every aspect of leadership and personal growth. I began to approach every setback as a disguised opportunity, every criticism as valuable feedback, every crisis as advanced training for future challenges. When senators opposed my policies, instead of seeing obstruction, I saw a chance to refine my ideas and build broader consensus. When citizens complained about imperial decisions, instead of hearing ingratitude, I heard information about how our governance affected real lives. When physical illness confined me to bed, instead of losing time, I gained opportunities for reflection and planning that the demands of daily rule rarely permitted. The impediment stone taught me to distinguish between obstacles that should be overcome and obstacles that should transform us. Some barriers exist to be broken through, but others exist to make us stronger in the breaking. The wisdom lies in recognizing which type you're facing. I learned to ask different questions when confronted with difficulties. What skill is this challenge trying to teach me? What weakness is this setback revealing that I need to address? How might this apparent disadvantage become a source of strength? What opportunity is hidden within this obvious problem? The stone also revealed that our greatest obstacles often become our greatest teachers. The senators who opposed me most vigorously forced me to become a better communicator. The military defeats that humbled me most deeply taught me lessons that led to decisive victories. The personal losses that devastated me most completely opened my heart to compassion that made me a more effective leader. I discovered that people who achieve great things don't avoid obstacles. They develop the ability to transform obstacles into stepping stones. They don't seek easier paths, but stronger legs. They don't wish for lighter burdens, but broader shoulders. The impediment stone sits on my desk as a daily reminder that what stands in the way becomes the way. Every difficulty you face is simultaneously the thing that blocks your progress and the thing that could accelerate your growth if you choose to see it correctly and respond to it wisely. This doesn't mean seeking out unnecessary hardship or romanticizing suffering. It means recognizing that since obstacles are inevitable, your only choice is whether they will weaken you or strengthen you, whether they will teach you or merely frustrate you, whether they will become stepping stones or stumbling blocks. On my bedside table rests a clay tablet, worn smooth by daily handling, inscribed with the morning preparation ritual that transformed my approach to leadership and life. This tablet contains the practical disciplines that converted philosophical theory into lived wisdom, the daily practices that built unshakable inner strength, one sunrise at a time. The routine began before dawn, in those precious moments when the palace lay silent and the demands of empire hadn't yet awakened. I would rise while darkness still covered Rome and make my way to a small private chamber where no servants were permitted to enter. This sacred hour belonged entirely to the preparation of my soul for whatever the day might bring. The morning practice had 3 essential components, each designed to strengthen a different aspect of inner resilience. First came mental preparation, the deliberate cultivation of the right mindset for facing uncertainty and challenge. I would sit facing east, watching for the first hint of dawn, and systematically prepare my thoughts for the day ahead. I would remind myself that today would bring both pleasant and unpleasant experiences, and that my happiness depended not on which type I encountered, but on how I chose to respond to each. I would recall that other people would act according to their own understanding, not mine, and that my job was to respond with virtue regardless of their choices. I would acknowledge that some things would go according to plan and others would not, and that my character would be revealed in how I handled both outcomes. This wasn't mere positive thinking, but rational preparation for reality. By acknowledging in advance that the day would contain difficulties, I eliminated the shock and resistance that usually accompany unexpected problems. By accepting that people would sometimes disappoint me, I reduced the emotional reaction that clouds judgment during conflicts. By expecting both success and failure, I prepared to maintain equanimity regardless of outcomes. The second component was philosophical study, the daily feeding of my mind with wisdom that would sustain me through challenges. I would read passages from Epictetus, reflecting on how his teachings applied to my specific responsibilities as emperor. I would review my own previous writings, examining whether my actions aligned with my stated principles. I would contemplate the lives of exemplary figures from history, asking how they might handle the decisions I would face. This intellectual nourishment served as armor against the day's temptations to abandon virtue for convenience. When senators pressured me to make expedient rather than just decisions, I would remember Cato's unwavering commitment to principle. When military advisors urged revenge against enemies, I would recall lessons about the futility of hatred. When personal losses threatened to overwhelm me, I would draw strength from examples of others who had maintained dignity through greater sufferings. The third component was intention setting, the conscious commitment to specific virtues I would practice during the day ahead. I wouldn't simply hope to be good. I would choose particular ways to embody goodness in my specific circumstances. If I knew I would face criticism in the Senate, I would commit to listening with genuine openness rather than defensive pride. If I anticipated difficult decisions about military strategy, I would pledge to choose based on justice rather than political advantage. The evening practice served as the complement to morning preparation. Each night, before sleep, I would return to my private chamber for honest self-examination. This wasn't self-flagellation for mistakes, but careful review designed to accelerate learning and growth. I would systematically examine the day's events, asking specific questions. Where did I respond with virtue, and where did I fall short? When did I act from wisdom rather than emotion? How did I handle unexpected challenges? What did I learn about my own character and capabilities? Where do I need to improve tomorrow? Most importantly, I would identify specific lessons that the day had taught me. Perhaps a senator's criticism had revealed a blind spot in my policy thinking. Maybe a citizen's complaint had shown me an unintended consequence of imperial decisions. Possibly a personal frustration had uncovered an area where I still needed to grow in patience or understanding. I kept a leather-bound journal for recording these daily insights, not grand philosophical treatises, but practical observations about the gap between my ideals and my actions, notes about what worked and what didn't, reminders about lessons I needed to remember. These writings became my most valuable possession, a record of real-world wisdom earned through the laboratory of daily experience. The disciplines also included physical practices that supported mental strength. I maintained simple eating habits that kept my mind clear rather than indulging in imperial luxuries that might cloud judgment. I took daily walks that provided time for reflection and exercise that kept my body healthy enough to serve my responsibilities. I practiced breathing exercises that helped maintain calm during stressful moments. Perhaps most importantly, I established regular periods of silence throughout the day, brief moments of stepping back from the constant demands of leadership to reconnect with my deeper purposes and principles. Even in the midst of crisis meetings or difficult negotiations, I would create small spaces of inner quiet where I could remember who I was beneath the role of emperor. These practices weren't burdensome duties, but life-giving sources of strength. The morning preparation filled me with confidence for facing uncertainty. The evening reflection provided closure and learning that prevented yesterday's mistakes from becoming tomorrow's patterns. The regular study connected me to wisdom, greater than my own limited perspective. The clay tablet reminds me that inner strength isn't built through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through consistent daily choices to prioritize character over convenience, principle over popularity, growth over comfort. These small, repeated disciplines compound over time into unshakable resilience that can weather any storm. Wrapped around my right arm, beneath the imperial robes, I wear a simple, leather armband that bears no imperial insignia or precious stones. This tolerance armband served as my constant reminder during Senate meetings and diplomatic negotiations that every person I encountered, no matter how unreasonable or difficult, was acting according to their own understanding of what was right and necessary. The armband became essential during my dealings with Senator Gaius Avidius Cassius, a man whose opposition to my policies bordered on personal vendetta. Cassius possessed genuine military talent, but seemed incapable of acknowledging any wisdom in imperial decisions that contradicted his own preferences. During Senate sessions, he would interrupt my presentations with sarcastic questions, twist my words to suggest incompetence, and rally other senators to oppose even reasonable proposals. My initial response was exactly what you might expect from a young emperor: anger, defensiveness, and the desire to use imperial power to silence this irritating critic. I would lie awake at night planning devastating responses to his attacks, rehearsing ways to humiliate him publicly, considering how to undermine his influence with other senators. But the tolerance armband reminded me of a fundamental Stoic principle. People do wrong not because they're evil, but because they're ignorant. Cassius wasn't opposing my policies out of malice. He genuinely believed his alternatives were superior. His attacks weren't personal assaults, but expressions of his sincere conviction that the empire would be better served by different approaches. This realization transformed my entire strategy for dealing with difficult people. Instead of trying to change Cassius, I focused on changing my response to him. Instead of fighting his opposition, I learned to use it as an opportunity to refine and strengthen my own positions. I began to see Cassius as an unwitting ally rather than an enemy. His pointed questions forced me to think more carefully about my proposals. His alternative suggestions, even when ultimately rejected, helped me anticipate problems I might not have considered. His passionate opposition gave me opportunities to practice patience, clarity, and gracious response to criticism. The armband reminded me that difficult people often serve necessary functions, even when they don't intend to. The senator who challenges every decision forces more thorough deliberation. The citizen who complains loudly about policies brings attention to their unintended consequences. The military commander who questions strategy helps prevent costly mistakes born of overconfidence. I learned to distinguish between the person and their behavior, between the individual and their current level of understanding. Cassius wasn't a fundamentally bad man. He was a patriot expressing his concerns in the only way he knew how. His methods might be abrasive, but his motives were often aligned with mine: the welfare of Rome. This perspective allowed me to respond to his criticisms without taking them personally. When he attacked my military strategies, I could examine his points on their merits rather than defending my ego. When he questioned my judgment, I could consider whether his concerns revealed blind spots in my thinking rather than fighting to prove my superiority. The most powerful technique I developed was what I called benevolent interpretation, the practice of assuming the best possible motives behind difficult behavior. When Cassius interrupted a presentation, instead of seeing disrespect, I saw urgent concern about important issues. When he organized opposition to my proposals, instead of seeing disloyalty, I saw passionate advocacy for alternative approaches he believed would better serve Rome. This didn't mean becoming naive about genuine threats or tolerating truly harmful behavior, but it meant starting from the assumption that most difficult people are trying to do what they think is right, even when their methods are problematic or their understanding is limited. I also learned the importance of maintaining my own emotional equilibrium regardless of others' behavior. The armband reminded me that I couldn't control how Cassius chose to express his disagreements, but I could control how I chose to receive and respond to them. His anger didn't require my anger in response. His disrespect didn't justify my disrespect in return. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that when you stop trying to change difficult people and focus instead on responding to them with virtue, they often change themselves. As I began treating Cassius with genuine respect despite his antagonistic behavior, his tone gradually became more constructive. As I listened seriously to his concerns, rather than dismissing them defensively, his criticisms became more thoughtful and specific. The tolerance armband taught me that dealing with difficult people is actually an advanced form of self-development. Every unreasonable person you encounter becomes a teacher, not because they intend to instruct you, but because they provide opportunities to practice patience, understanding, clarity, and grace under pressure. I learned to thank difficult people silently for the gifts they unknowingly provided. The senator who tested my patience helped me develop greater emotional control. The citizen who questioned my decisions forced me to think more clearly about their justification. The military commander who challenged my authority taught me to lead through influence rather than intimidation. The most profound insight was recognizing that we all are someone else's difficult person. My own passionate convictions probably seemed unreasonable to others. My own communication style likely frustrated people who preferred different approaches. My own limited understanding undoubtedly led me to oppose ideas that might have been wiser than my alternatives. This humbling recognition created genuine compassion for difficult people, rather than mere tolerance. They weren't fundamentally different from me. They were simply expressing their own version of the same human tendency to see the world through the lens of personal experience and conviction. On my finger, I wear a simple iron ring that bends under extreme pressure, but never breaks, a physical reminder that true strength lies not in rigid resistance to setbacks, but in flexible resilience that allows us to yield without being destroyed. This resilience ring became my most treasured possession during the greatest failure of my imperial career. The disaster began with what should have been a routine diplomatic mission to the Germanic tribes. I had negotiated what I believed was a comprehensive peace treaty that would secure our northern borders for generations. The agreement represented months of careful diplomacy, significant financial concessions, and personal investment in building trust with tribal leaders who had been our enemies for decades. 3 days after the treaty signing, Germanic forces launched coordinated attacks across our entire northern frontier. They had used our negotiations as a screen for military preparations, exploiting every piece of intelligence they had gathered during our diplomatic meetings. Within a week, they had overrun positions we had held for 50 years and were threatening major Roman settlements. The military catastrophe was devastating enough, but the personal humiliation felt even worse. I had been completely deceived by leaders I thought I understood. My judgment, which I prided myself on, had been utterly wrong. My desire for a peaceful solution had blinded me to obvious signs of bad faith. The blood of Roman soldiers was on my hands because of my naive trust in enemies who had never intended to honor their agreements. For 3 days, I couldn't bring myself to leave my private chambers. The weight of failure pressed down on me like a physical force, making it difficult. To breathe, impossible to think clearly about necessary military responses. I replayed every conversation from the negotiations, torturing myself with signs I should have seen, questions I should have asked, precautions I should have taken. The iron ring cut into my finger as I clenched my fists in rage at my own stupidity. But when I looked down at that simple band of metal, I remembered why I had chosen iron over gold, not for its beauty, but for its practical strength. Iron bends under pressure that would shatter harder materials. It yields without breaking, adapts without surrendering its essential nature. I forced myself to examine the setback through the lens of Stoic principles, rather than wounded pride. What exactly had I lost? My reputation for infallibility, but I had never actually been infallible, merely lucky enough to avoid previous exposures of my limitations. My confidence in my judgment, but overconfidence, had probably contributed to this very failure. My comfortable assumptions about human nature, but those assumptions had clearly needed correction. What remained untouched by the failure? My commitment to justice that could be demonstrated as readily in defeat as in victory. My capacity for courage that was needed more during setbacks than during successes. My opportunity to learn and grow that was actually enhanced by the painful lessons this disaster provided. My responsibility to serve Rome that continued regardless of my personal mistakes. The ring reminded me that setbacks serve as tests that reveal character rather than create it. This failure didn't make me a bad leader. It revealed areas where I needed to become a better one. The Germanic deception didn't prove I was naive. It showed me where my trust needed to be tempered with verification. I began to see the disaster as expensive education rather than senseless tragedy. The cost was indeed high. Lives lost, territory compromised, resources diverted from other priorities. But the lessons were proportionally valuable. I learned to verify treaty compliance through intelligence networks rather than taking opponents' word. I discovered the importance of preparing for treachery even while working for peace. I understood that good intentions must be backed by realistic precautions. Most importantly, I learned how to fail without being destroyed by failure. The iron ring taught me to bend under the pressure of setbacks without losing my essential shape as a leader committed to virtue. I could acknowledge my mistakes without abandoning my principles. I could accept responsibility for poor decisions without concluding that I was fundamentally incompetent. The Stoic response to setbacks became a systematic process I would use throughout the remainder of my reign. First, I would allow myself to feel the initial emotional impact without trying to suppress or deny it. Disappointment, anger, and regret are natural responses to failure. The goal isn't to eliminate them, but to prevent them from controlling my actions. Second, I would examine what aspects of the setback were within my control and what aspects were not. I couldn't control the Germanic tribe's decision to break faith, but I could control how I responded to their aggression. I couldn't change the lives that had been lost, but I could ensure their sacrifice wasn't meaningless by learning from the failure that contributed to their deaths. Third, I would extract every possible lesson from the experience. What warning? Signs had I missed? What assumptions had proven false? What skills did I need to develop? What systems needed to be changed? Failure becomes tragedy when we learn nothing from it. It becomes education when we allow it to improve our future judgment. Fourth, I would commit to specific changes based on what I had learned, not vague promises to do better, but concrete adjustments to policies, procedures, and personal practices. The Germanic disaster led to comprehensive reforms in our intelligence gathering, treaty verification, and border defense strategies. Finally, I would return to action as quickly as possible. The iron ring reminded me that resilience is demonstrated through recovery, not through avoiding failure. A leader who never fails is probably taking too few risks. A leader who fails but doesn't recover is probably in the wrong position. The ring taught me that setbacks are not interruptions to a successful life. They are integral parts of any life worth living. The goal isn't to avoid failure, but to fail forward, to let each setback make you stronger, wiser, and more effective in facing future challenges. On my desk sits an hourglass filled with black sand, its grains falling in steady, unstoppable rhythm, a constant reminder that death comes for emperors and slaves alike, and that this certainty should create urgency for virtue rather than paralysis from fear. This mortality hourglass became my most faithful advisor during the years when illness and war brought death close enough to touch. I first understood the power of memento mori during a fever that nearly claimed my life in my 40th year. For 6 days I drifted between consciousness and delirium while the empire's physicians debated whether I would survive to see another dawn. In those twilight moments between life and death, I experienced a clarity that no amount of philosophical study had provided. I saw with perfect transparency how much time I had wasted on trivial concerns. Hours spent worrying about senators' opinions that would be forgotten within a year. Days invested in political maneuvering that would matter to no one after my death. Months devoted to accumulating possessions that would belong to others. The moment I drew my last breath, but I also saw with equal clarity what had true value in the face of mortality. The moments when I had acted with genuine justice, regardless of personal cost. The decisions made from principle rather than convenience. The times when I had chosen courage over comfort, wisdom over popularity, service over self-interest. These were the only possessions death could not take from me. When the fever finally broke and I returned to full consciousness, I immediately ordered the creation of the mortality hourglass. I wanted a visible reminder that my time was limited and that this limitation should inspire rather than terrify me. Each grain of black sand represented a moment I would never recover, an opportunity that once passed would never return. The hourglass transformed my approach to daily decisions. Before agreeing to any meeting, I would ask, is this worth the irreplaceable time it will consume? Before engaging in any argument, I would consider, will this matter when I'm on my deathbed? Before pursuing any goal, I would examine, does this contribute to virtue or merely to vanity? This wasn't morbid obsession with death, but practical recognition of life's preciousness. When you truly accept that your time is finite, every moment becomes valuable. Every opportunity to act with virtue becomes urgent. Every chance to serve something greater than yourself becomes a gift rather than a burden. I began each day by turning the hourglass and watching the first grains of sand fall. While contemplating the fundamental questions, if this were my last day, how would I want to spend it? What would I regret not having done? What kind of person would I want to be remembered as? These weren't abstract philosophical exercises, but immediate practical guides. If today might be my last day, I wouldn't waste it harboring resentment against senators who opposed my policies. I would focus on governing well regardless of their cooperation. I wouldn't spend precious hours accumulating wealth that death would immediately redistribute. I would invest my energy in decisions that would benefit Rome long after my departure. The mortality hourglass also revealed the absurdity of many fears that had previously controlled my behavior. Why worry about critics' opinions when both critics and criticized would soon be dust? Why accumulate possessions when ownership is always temporary? Why cling to power when all earthly authority is merely borrowed from death? This perspective liberated me from the anxiety of trying to control my legacy. I couldn't determine how historians would judge my reign or whether future generations would remember my name. But I could ensure that whatever time remained to me was spent in ways that honored virtue regardless of recognition. I learned to see death not as the enemy of a meaningful life, but as the force that gives life meaning. Without mortality, there would be no urgency to grow, no pressure to choose virtue over vice, no reason to take action rather than merely contemplate. Death's inevitability creates the scarcity that makes our choices matter. The hourglass taught me to distinguish between things that would matter on my deathbed and things that merely seemed important in the moment. Senators' applause irrelevant in the face of mortality. Citizens' gratitude pleasant but not essential for a life well lived. Military victories satisfying but not the measure of character. Personal comfort nice but not the purpose of existence. But virtue? That would matter until my final breath. The quality of my character, the integrity of my decisions, the love I had shown to others, the service I had provided to the common good, these would define the worth of my life. Regardless of external achievements, during the plague years, when death surrounded us daily, the hourglass became a source of strange comfort. While others panicked about the uncertainty of survival, I had already made peace with mortality's certainty. This allowed me to lead with calm purpose rather than desperate fear, to make decisions based on what was right rather than what might extend my life. I shared the practice of memento mori with my son Commodus, though I fear he never fully grasped its wisdom. I tried to teach him that remembering death's approach should make life more precious, not more frightening. That awareness of time's limits should inspire excellence, not paralysis. The black sand continues to fall, grain by grain, moment by moment. Each falling grain reminds me that this present instant is all I truly possess. The past exists only in memory. The future exists only in possibility. But this moment, this choice, this breath, this opportunity to act with virtue, this is real and immediate and mine. When your time comes to face the mortality hourglass in your own life, remember that death gives weight to every decision and urgency to every virtue. The sand falls equally for all of us. What matters is how we choose to spend the time that remains. Pressed into the wax of my imperial seal is an inscription that governs every decision I make. Act with purpose, not impulse. This action seal serves as the final checkpoint between contemplation and deed, ensuring that my responses emerge from deliberate choice rather than emotional reaction. Learning to discipline action transformed me from a reactive ruler into a purposeful leader. The lesson came at great cost during the early years of my reign, when a grain shortage in Alexandria threatened to spark riots that could spread throughout the eastern provinces. Reports reached Rome describing desperate crowds gathering in the streets, merchants hoarding supplies, and local officials losing control of an increasingly volatile situation. My immediate impulse was to dispatch legions to restore order through force. The imperial advisors supported this response, swift, decisive action that would demonstrate Roman authority and prevent the unrest from encouraging similar outbreaks elsewhere. I had already begun drafting deployment orders when I noticed my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the action seal. That tremor stopped me. I realized I was acting from fear and anger rather than from wisdom and justice. The impulse to use force felt powerful and satisfying, but was it right? Was it effective? Did it address the underlying problem or merely its visible symptoms? I set down the stylus and spent the night examining my motives and options. Why was my first instinct to respond with violence? Because it felt like strength. Because it was simple. Because it would satisfy my frustration with the disruption to imperial order. But Stoic philosophy had taught me to distrust responses that felt satisfying in the moment. Virtue often requires choices that feel difficult or uncomfortable. I forced myself to consider alternatives that address the actual problem rather than just its manifestations. The crowds weren't rioting because they enjoyed chaos. They were desperate because they couldn't feed their families. The merchants weren't hoarding grain out of malice. They were responding to economic incentives that made scarcity profitable. The local officials weren't losing control because they were incompetent. They lacked the resources and authority to manage a crisis of this magnitude. Instead of sending soldiers, I dispatched emergency grain supplies from imperial reserves, along with commissioners empowered to regulate prices and ensure fair distribution. Instead of punishing the crowds, I addressed their legitimate grievances. Instead of demonstrating force, I demonstrated justice. The action seal reminded me that between every stimulus and response lies a space, a moment of choice where virtue can override impulse. In that space, we have the opportunity to act from our highest principles rather than our lowest fears. I developed a systematic approach to disciplined action that served me throughout my reign. First, I would identify the immediate impulse and examine its source. Was I responding from anger, fear, pride, or desire for comfort? These emotions might contain useful information, but they were dangerous guides for action. Second, I would consider the long-term consequences of different responses. How would this action affect not just the immediate situation, but the precedent it set for future decisions? What would it teach others about Roman justice and character? How would it influence the development of virtue in myself and those around me? Third, I would ask what the ideal version of myself would do in this situation. Not the expedient response, not the popular response, not the easy response, but the response that best embodied wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Finally, I would act with full commitment to the chosen course, regardless of whether it felt comfortable or brought immediate rewards. Disciplined action requires following through on principled decisions even when circumstances change or opposition emerges. The discipline of action applies to small daily choices as much as to major imperial decisions. When a senator made a particularly irritating criticism during a meeting, my impulse was to respond with sarcasm or dismissal. But the action seal reminded me to pause and consider, what would patience look like in this moment? How could I respond? In a way that honored both my dignity and his right to express concerns. When citizens complained about policies I knew were necessary for their long-term welfare, my impulse was to explain why they were wrong or to dismiss their short-sightedness. But disciplined action meant listening with genuine empathy and finding ways to address their immediate concerns while maintaining necessary long-term strategies. The seal taught me that right action often requires acting against immediate inclinations. Courage means moving forward despite fear, not in the absence of fear. Justice means doing what's right despite personal cost, not when it's convenient. Wisdom means making difficult decisions based on principle, not avoiding decisions that might be unpopular. I learned to recognize the difference between thoughtful pause and paralytic hesitation. The discipline of action doesn't mean endless deliberation. It means taking the time necessary to ensure that actions spring from virtue rather than impulse, then acting decisively once that clarity is achieved. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that disciplined action builds confidence in a way that impulsive reaction never can. When you know that your responses emerge from careful consideration of principles rather than emotional reactions, you can act with conviction even in uncertain circumstances. The action seal reminds me daily that character is built through choices, and choices reveal themselves through actions. Every moment of disciplined response strengthens the habit of virtue. Every time you pause between impulse and action to consider what wisdom requires, you become more capable of embodying that wisdom. In future challenges, virtue without action remains mere philosophy. Action without virtue becomes mere activity. The discipline of action bridges the gap between noble intentions and meaningful impact, ensuring that your highest principles guide your most practical decisions, carved into a marble tablet in my private study is the transformation calendar that maps the precise journey from chaos to calm, a 30-day progression that builds Stoic resilience through systematic practice rather than haphazard effort. This calendar represents the distillation of everything I learned about converting philosophical principles into lived wisdom. The transformation doesn't happen through dramatic moments of enlightenment, but through small, consistent choices that compound over time like drops of water gradually carving canyons through solid rock. Each week of the 30-day practice focuses on different aspects of Stoic development, creating a foundation that can support a lifetime of growth. Week 1 establishes the foundation through basic awareness and fundamental practices. Days 1 to 3 focus on the discipline of perception, learning to observe your automatic interpretations of events and asking whether other explanations might be equally valid. Begin each day by identifying one situation you expect to find frustrating and consciously preparing alternative ways to view it. Days 4 to 5 introduce the dichotomy of control. Carry a small object in your pocket, a coin, stone, or ring, and each time you feel stress or frustration, touch it and ask, is this situation up to me or not up to me? If it's not up to you, practice consciously releasing anxiety about the outcome. If it is up to you, focus your energy on taking appropriate action. Days 6 to 7 establish evening reflection as a daily practice. Before sleep, spend 10 minutes reviewing the day's events and asking, where did I respond with virtue? Where did I react from emotion? What did I learn about my character? What can I do better tomorrow? Don't judge yourself harshly for failures. Treat them as information for improvement. Week 2 deepens perception and builds acceptance of life's fundamental realities. Days 8-10 practice negative visualization for 10 minutes each morning. Imagine losing something you value, your health, your job, a relationship, not to create anxiety, but to increase appreciation for what you currently have. Notice how this practice affects your gratitude throughout the day. Days 11-12 focus on accepting difficult people and situations. When someone annoys or frustrates you, practice the exercise of benevolent interpretation, assuming the best possible motives for their behavior. Remember that they're acting according to their own understanding, just as you act according to yours. Days 13-14 work on transforming obstacles into opportunities. When facing any setback or challenge, ask, what is this situation trying to teach me? How might this apparent problem become a source of strength? What opportunity is hidden within this difficulty? Look for at least one benefit in every obstacle you encounter. Week 3 introduces advanced practices for building unshakable inner strength. Days 15 to 17 focus on building your inner citadel through morning meditation. Spend 15 minutes each morning in quiet contemplation, visualizing yourself as a fortress with strong walls that protect your core values and commitments. Practice retreating to this inner sanctuary during stressful moments throughout the day. Days 18-19 practice the discipline of desire. When you notice yourself wanting something beyond your control, other people's approval, specific outcomes, different circumstances, consciously redirect that desire towards something you can actually achieve, responding with wisdom, acting with integrity, growing through the experience. Days 20-21 work on memento mori, remembering mortality to create urgency for virtue. Begin each day by acknowledging that this could be your last day and asking, how do I want to spend these irreplaceable hours? What would I regret not doing? How can I act in ways that honor my deepest values? Week 4 integrates all practices and prepares for sustainable long-term growth. Days 22-24 focus on the discipline of action. Before making any significant decision or response, pause and ask, am I acting from impulse or from principle? What would virtue look like in this situation? How can I respond in a way that builds character rather than merely solving problems? Days 25-27 practice virtue as the only true good. When facing any challenge or opportunity, consciously choose responses that embody wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, regardless of external rewards or punishments. Notice how this focus on character over consequences affects your peace of mind. Days 28-30 establish sustainable practices for continued growth. Create a personal Stoic practice that combines the elements that proved most valuable during your 30-day experiment. Design a routine you can maintain long-term, perhaps morning reflection, evening review, and one midday reminder to check your alignment with virtue. Throughout all 30 days, keep a simple journal recording your observations and insights. Don't write elaborate philosophical treatises. Just note what worked, what was difficult, what you learned about yourself, and how the practices affected your daily experience. The transformation calendar includes specific challenges designed to test and strengthen your developing resilience. Week 2 includes deliberately seeking out a difficult conversation. Week 3 involves volunteering for a task you've been avoiding. Week 4 requires offering help to someone who has been difficult to deal with. Remember that this 30-day practice is not a cure that eliminates life's challenges, but a training program that builds your capacity to handle those challenges with wisdom and grace. You're not trying to become perfect. You're developing the skills to respond to imperfection with virtue. The calendar reminds you that Stoic resilience is not built through avoiding difficulties, but through facing them with better tools. Each day's practice prepares you for life's inevitable storms by strengthening the inner qualities that remain steady regardless of external circumstances. By the end of 30 days, you won't have mastered Stoicism, you'll have established a foundation for lifelong growth. The real transformation happens in the months and years that follow, as these practices become integrated into your character and guide your responses to whatever challenges arise. In my private library stands a bound codex containing the principles I developed for leading others while maintaining inner peace, a leadership guide that emerged from decades of learning to influence through example rather than force. This leadership codex represents the most practical application of Stoic philosophy, how inner strength creates outer influence that endures long after the leader has departed. The transformation from reactive ruler to purposeful leader began with a profound realization during a crisis that tested every aspect of my authority. A severe earthquake had devastated several cities in Asia Minor, killing thousands and leaving survivors without shelter, food, or hope. The provincial governors looked to Rome for immediate solutions. The Senate demanded swift action, and citizens throughout the empire watched to see how their emperor would respond to catastrophe. My initial approach followed conventional leadership, thinking, issue commands, deploy resources, demonstrate imperial power through decisive intervention. But as I prepared to announce our response, I recognized an opportunity to lead differently, to model the very Stoic principles I had been studying rather than merely applying practical solutions to urgent problems. Instead of projecting confidence I didn't feel, I acknowledged the genuine uncertainty we faced about the best ways to help. Instead of promising outcomes I couldn't guarantee, I committed to principles I could embody: justice in distributing aid, courage in facing the crisis personally, wisdom in learning from those closest to the devastation, temperance in using resources responsibly. I traveled to the affected region myself, not as an imperial tour, but as a student seeking to understand the reality behind the reports. I spent days talking with survivors, local officials, and aid workers, asking questions rather than giving speeches, listening rather than lecturing, learning rather than commanding. This approach initially confused those who expected traditional imperial leadership, decisive pronouncements backed by unquestionable authority. But something remarkable happened as people observed my genuine commitment to understanding before acting. They began to trust not just my power but my judgment. The Leadership Codex captures this essential insight. People follow authority because they must, but they follow character because they want to. When your leadership emerges from inner strength, rather than external position, it influences others at a deeper level and creates lasting change rather than temporary compliance. I learned to lead by asking better questions rather than providing all the answers. Instead of telling provincial governors what policies to implement, I would ask, what approaches have you tried? What obstacles are you encountering? What resources would help you serve your citizens more effectively? This collaborative approach often produced better solutions than imperial edicts while developing local capacity for future challenges. The Codex documents how Stoic leadership transforms organizational culture through modeled behavior. When team members see a leader maintaining composure under pressure, they learn to respond to their own stress with greater calm. When they observe someone taking responsibility for failures without making excuses, they become more accountable for their own mistakes. When they witness leadership that prioritizes long-term virtue over short-term advantage, they begin to make similar choices in their own areas of responsibility. During the plague years, this principle-centered leadership became essential for maintaining both effectiveness and morale. I couldn't promise that the disease would end quickly or that everyone would survive. But I could demonstrate how to face uncertainty with dignity, how to serve others despite personal risk, how to maintain hope without denying reality. The most powerful leadership tool proved to be vulnerability, the willingness to admit uncertainty, acknowledge mistakes, and ask for help when needed. Traditional imperial leadership demanded an appearance of infallibility that prevented learning and growth. Stoic leadership embraced fallibility as an opportunity for improvement and connection. I established regular sessions where anyone in my administration could question my decisions, suggest alternatives, or point out problems they observed. These weren't mere formalities, but genuine opportunities for course correction based on input from those closest to the practical effects of our policies. The Codex emphasizes that Stoic leaders influence through attraction rather than coercion. When people see someone who remains calm during crisis, thoughtful during complexity, and principled during pressure, they naturally want to understand how to develop similar qualities. Leadership becomes teaching through example rather than control through authority. This approach requires patience because it works more slowly than authoritarian methods. You can force immediate compliance through threats and rewards, but you build lasting influence only through consistent demonstration of character. The earthquake response took longer to implement using collaborative methods, but the solutions we developed proved more sustainable because they emerged from local understanding rather than imperial assumption. The Leadership Codex also addresses the challenge of maintaining personal integrity while exercising institutional power. The temptation to compromise principles for expedient results is constant in leadership positions. The antidote is regular return to core questions. Am I serving? Virtue or ego? Am I solving problems or avoiding them? Am I building others' capacity or creating dependence on my authority? Perhaps most importantly, the Codex recognizes that the ultimate test of leadership is what happens when the leader is gone. Authoritarian leadership collapses when the authority figure departs because it creates dependence rather than development. Stoic leadership builds capability in others that continues long after the original leader has moved on. I measure my leadership legacy not by the policies I implemented or the problems I solved, but by the people who learned to embody Stoic principles through observing and working with me. The citizens who learned to respond to crisis with calm, the officials who learned to prioritize service over personal advancement, the soldiers who learned to lead with courage and compassion. These are the multiplying effects of principle-centered leadership. Your own leadership opportunities may not involve governing empires, but the principles remain identical. Inner strength creates outer influence, character attracts followers more powerfully than authority, and the deepest impact comes from helping others develop their own capacity for virtue rather than creating dependence on your solutions. In the center of my study burns an eternal flame that has never been extinguished during my reign, a living symbol of the enduring nature of Stoic wisdom and the continuous journey of personal growth that extends far beyond any 30-day practice or single lifetime. This flame reminds me that what you have begun by reading these words is not a destination to be reached, but a path to be walked for as long as you draw breath. As I write these final thoughts, knowing that my own time grows short, and that future generations will inherit both the empire I have served and the principles I have tried to embody, I feel compelled to offer you the most honest counsel I can provide about the journey that lies ahead. The 30 days of practice you have completed are not graduation but commencement. You have built a foundation, not a finished structure. The real test of your Stoic resilience will come in the months and years that follow, when the initial enthusiasm fades and the daily choice to live by these principles becomes routine rather than exciting. There will be days when you forget everything you have learned and react with the same emotional patterns that once controlled you. There will be setbacks that test whether your inner strength is genuine or merely theoretical. There will be pressures that tempt you to abandon virtue for convenience, principle for popularity, long-term wisdom for short-term comfort. This is not failure. This is the human condition. Even after decades of practice, I still find moments when my first impulse is to respond with anger rather than patience, to seek control over things beyond my influence, to want reality to conform to my preferences rather than accepting what is. The difference is not in the elimination of these impulses, but in the speed of recovery from them. Where once I might have remained angry for days, now I might catch myself within hours. Where once setbacks would derail me for weeks, now I can usually find the lesson and move forward within days. Where once I would resist difficult circumstances until exhaustion, now I can often find acceptance and appropriate action more quickly. This is the true measure of progress in Stoic practice. Not perfection, but resilience. Not the absence of challenges, but improved capacity to handle them. Not immunity to difficult emotions, but faster return to equilibrium after experiencing them. The eternal flame teaches me that wisdom is not a possession to be acquired, but a practice to be maintained. Like the flame that requires constant fuel. To continue burning, your Stoic resilience requires consistent attention to remain strong. The daily habits, the regular reflection, the continuous choice to respond with virtue, these are the fuel that keeps the flame of wisdom alive in your life. As you continue this journey, you will discover that Stoic practice evolves and deepens over time. The principles that seemed merely intellectual when you first encountered them will become lived experience through repeated application. The exercises that felt artificial or forced will become natural responses to life's challenges. You will also find that your practice begins to influence others, often without conscious effort on your part. When colleagues see you maintaining calm during crisis, they begin to wonder how you do it. When friends observe you responding to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, they start asking questions about your approach. When family members witness you handling setbacks with grace, they become interested in learning similar skills. This is how Stoic wisdom spreads, not through preaching or persuasion, but through the quiet example of people who have learned to live by these principles. Your journey forward is not just personal transformation, but contribution to the larger human project of learning to respond to life's challenges with wisdom rather than reaction. The path ahead will require patience with yourself and others. There are no shortcuts to genuine character development, no quick fixes for the complex challenges of human existence. But there is profound satisfaction in knowing that every day offers new opportunities to practice virtue. Every setback provides chances to build resilience. Every interaction becomes a moment to embody the person you aspire to become. Remember that you are part of a tradition that spans millennia, men and women, who have discovered that happiness comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing inner strength, not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with courage and wisdom, not from achieving perfection, but from continuously choosing growth. The eternal flame burns for you as it has burned for countless others who have walked this path. Let it remind you that your journey forward is both deeply personal and connected to something larger than yourself. Let it inspire you to continue practicing when motivation wanes, to keep learning when you think you understand, to maintain hope when circumstances seem hopeless. Your life can become a testament to the power of these principles, a light that guides others toward their own discovery of inner strength. The flame passes from one generation to the next through people like you who choose to live by virtue regardless of external rewards, who respond to challenges with wisdom rather than reaction, who build character through daily practice rather than dramatic gestures. Take these principles forward into your life with confidence and humility. Trust in their power to transform how you experience every aspect of existence. And remember that the journey of building Stoic resilience is not just about creating a better life for yourself. It is about becoming the kind of person who makes life better for everyone you encounter. The flame burns on. The path continues. Your journey forward begins now.